Yes, I got a thumbs up. So thank you all for being here today. We are excited to bring to you yet another installment of our Mellon-Sawyer Seminar Series on catastrophe data and transformation this time, which was our way of thinking about how catastrophe and the data around disaster might be collected about the past. We also enjoyed, I think we can say, two pre-modernists in our company, although I just found out that Dagomar is working on cosmic history that comes up to the present.
Sorry.
It's okay, I will forgive you because you're still interested in talking to paleoclimatologists, which I'm really excited about. So my glorious task today is to introduce our speakers. And what I'm going to do is introduce each of them in the order that they're going to speak, including our respondent, just give you a little about them, and then I'll let them run. And we will, as usual, have two shorter talks, a little response, and then lots of time for questions. So thank you all for being here today. Our first speaker today will be Dagomar Degroot, who is an associate professor in environmental history at Georgetown University. His first book, which is the one I admit that caught my attention, was The Frigid Golden Age, which dealt with sort of Dutch resilience in the face of the Ice Age. His more recent forthcoming book, which I just mentioned in a sort of aside, it's too modern, is Ripples on the Cosmic Ocean, which is a kind of history of the solar system, which seems to me to be both a history of the solar system and a history of humans looking at the solar system, and actually sounds like it does go back into our period pretty well as well. So I'm happy to hear that. I say our period because I'm going to draw you back in. And has also done a lot of publishing and, editing and other forms of support for the discipline, including the Oxford Handbook of Resilience in Climate History, and numerous publications in journals, including both Nature and the AHR. And most of the people in my department are trying to publish in the AHR, but if we publish in Nature, we feel really cool. So that's very exciting. Our second speaker today is Jessica Otis, who is an assistant professor of history and the director of public products at the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media at George Mason University. Her book, By the Numbers, Numeracy, Religion, and the Quantitative Transformation of Early Modern England, explores changing technologies of knowledge and how they impacted the early modern people, how they interacted with the world around them. Jessica's interest, as I understand it, started out in mathematics and then slipped into history by way of a backdoor. And so those of you who really crave numbers and deep analytical conversations, we will not let you down today. Her NSF-funded Death by Numbers project, which I hope you have all received a bit of swag from. And more stickers. There are stickers to be had. Is in the process of transcribing, publishing, and quantitatively analyzing the London Bills of Mortality, which I first encountered when I started researching the plague, and all plague researchers go, ooh, and then we just end up talking about England endlessly. That's a different problem. Yeah, which we won't go into right now, but we might go into later in our conversation, because as I say, it's a pretty big problem. So, and after we hear from our two main speakers, we will have a response. Today, Alex will be responding. Alex Sherman is a PhD candidate in the English literature in the Stanford University and part of the core research team at the Stanford Literary Lab, run by Mark Algie Hewitt. He studies literature and science along with the digital humanities, the geography of colonialism, and the oceanic humanities, focusing on the 18th century British Empire. His work has appeared or is forthcoming in PMLA, a Cambridge Critical Concepts volume on space and literary studies, which could mean just about anything I have to say. We'll
Outer space? Outer space?
Exactly. I don't think so. I don't think so. And cultural analytics in post 45.
No, yeah. Nice.
And prior to graduate school, you were also a math guy. So we have some mathematics connections. And by the way, Dagomar told us earlier he became a historian because he didn't have the math for astrophysics, but I was just going to say he didn't have the math for astrophysics, which is really high level math.
Didn't have much math in general.
No math at all. So the mathless and the mathy together at last. At that, I will hand over to you first, Dagomar.
Sure.
Take it away.
Well, first question is how to actually make this thing go. sort of going, but I do need it on PowerPoint. And I
Is
don't
it
know
not on
if it is.
PowerPoint?
Is Erin in the house?
No.
I think so. This is open as-
Yeah,
Yeah, it's not gonna work, unfortunately.
it has to actually be in PowerPoint.
I think so.
Is that possible? Do we have PowerPoint on this machine?
Oh, worst comes to worst, we can always just connect it to. That would be the situation right now.
Yeah, I think that'll be faster. Let's switch it
Yeah.
over. Let's switch it over. Good plan.
Okay, that's gonna be okay with the Zoom, right?
Yeah, what'll happen is it'll just project onto Zoom, right?
Yes.
Well, what happens is we should ask someone on Zoom to shout out if they can't see it. Do you remember the old days when we would be at school and they would be showing us movies? Where like on a reel and go clack, 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 clack. You laugh, but that was the day, those were the days where the teacher would go, I need a kid. Because the clack machine wasn't working right. Now these days, where's the kids when we need them, right? To make our clack machine work right.
I say, we had VHSs by the time I was in school, so there was no clack.
We did get VHSs by the end, but all those old educational movies were still on reels.
Yeah, and then some lucky kid got to push the button. like-
Actually, when the VHS came out, we definitely needed the kids then. The teachers had no idea how to handle the VHS. That was some complex technology. All right.
Okay. When I was in South Korea a while ago, I met the Prime Minister of South Korea, and he gave me his business card. And I had nothing to give him because I didn't carry business cards or anything. It was a humiliating moment. And now I find out there's a whole different level of with the swag. I should have given him a sticker. I should have given him a notebook and a business card. My goodness, he raised the standard. It is an honor to be up here with you. So for the next, I guess, 20 minutes sharp, I will talk about climate data from different archives. What they tell us, what they don't, some of their limitations, some of their strengths. And hopefully I'll get through all of it. But if I don't, I will meekly sit down with no protest. So as we all know, there's a ton of climate data coming in real time. As we speak, this is a representation, I hope you can see it, of climate data coming in 2013, just from the surface of the Earth. And you can see just how much of it there is. This is just data collected by NOAA and NASA, so it's not comprehensive. There's a ton of data even coming from the oceans, from the poles, from the surface of the Earth. The red dots are the most common, the most abundant, and those are just weather stations, again, scattered all over the Earth, that are equipped with weather instruments like thermometers, like barometers. If this is not a comprehensive map, it doesn't include the third dimension, for example, commercial aviation. Commercial aircraft are also equipped with weather instruments. And of course, it doesn't include satellite constellations. These are operated by NASA, but of course, other space agencies also have their satellites. This includes the ISS. These spacecraft are beaming information down in real time as well. So there is an enormous amount of information. In fact, so much that no human could ever make sense of it. We need computer models to process all of these data. And they give us really pretty pictures, right? Like this depiction of temperature anomalies in March of this year. You can see just how hot some parts of the Earth are. Some parts are cooler than the recent average as well. But a very, very complex picture and quite beautiful to look at. We can also place these data in context. This is a graph that has cost me a lot of sleep over the last year, honestly. Sea surface temperatures in 2023 in red and 2024 in black, which are really just exploding off the scale as a result of a bunch of different things, including human greenhouse gas emissions, also El Nino, possibly the subsurface Tonga eruption, maybe a reduction of African dust, and perhaps even reductions in sulfur pollutions from shipping. In any case, a very scary picture showing that the oceans are superheated, particularly in the North Atlantic right now. But the context they provide is limited. This is a reconstruction of temperature anomalies going back only to the late 19th century. Why only the late 19th century? Because that is when weather stations were scattered across enough of the globe to permit global reconstructions like this one. So what happened before the late 19th century? It's important that we find out for a few different reasons. One, we really like to know whether the Earth has experienced the kind of heat that we're throwing at it right now in the past. And if it has, that should give us some confidence. We should know, for example, that ecosystems have experienced this kind of temperature before and can probably survive. But for the historian, I would also like to know whether populations around the world have encountered climate change before. If so, how did they respond? Is that an important part of history? Can we learn from their responses? Can we use them to construct better climate policy, right? So how do we then figure out what happened before the late 19th century? Well, we can use something called the archives of societies. And these are just things created by human beings that tell us either directly record weather or that register in some ways activities, human activities that must have been directly influenced by weather. So for example, the date of the harvest or the use of harbors in cold winters. Now, ship logbook is an example of one of these sources from the archives of societies that can actually tell us both. A logbook like this was created by mariners after they left the coast in the 16th century. Their ships were seaworthy enough to permit that. And they couldn't yet calculate longitude. So what they had to do was use something called dead reckoning. And they had to try and estimate any sort of influence on their journey, like wind direction and velocity. So do their best to figure out where they were. So in a logbook like this one, you'll see wind direction right here. And then you'll also see these references to wind velocity, qualitative references like hard wind or little wind or fresh gale. And we can use the Beaufort scale to quantify these references to wind velocity. The Beaufort scale goes from 0, which is no wind at all, to 12, which means hurricane. So we can then graph, reconstruct changes in wind velocity based on ship logbooks. We can even construct wind roses like these, which give us an indication of changes in wind direction over time, maybe in a particular year, but perhaps even over a decade. And because we know how the broader climate system operates, we can use these wind roses to gain an impression of atmospheric circulation over larger parts of the Earth, even if we just have logbooks from one little part of the English Channel. The scale of these data can be immense. This is a depiction of individual ship logbook entries recorded between 1750 and 1850 by European mariners. And this is from a database that we store at historicalclimatology.com. So you can see there are hundreds of thousands of entries, and we can use them to gain an impression of changes in the velocity of trade winds, for example, over about 100 years. These are data that we can't access, obviously, using instrumental sources. We can use them in ship logbooks. We can use some of the same methods to reconstruct precipitation or temperature before the development of these weather station networks. And to do that, we have to quantify qualitative descriptions of rainfall on a simple ordinal scale. This is not like high-tech science, frankly. So if people are talking about really, there's a lot of rain, we might give it a 2. Or if people say, well, it's very, very dry, maybe we'll use a -1, right? If they don't mention precipitation at all, we give that a 0. But using this, we can gain a rough record of monsoon strength, for example, in India, going back into the 18th century, before the advent of instrumental sources in this region. We can make that a little bit more sophisticated. We can add another level of resolution, going from -3 to +3, for example, And in this case, breaking Africa into 90 different parts. With that, we can create maps like this one, showing precipitation across Africa, again, for periods that are not covered by instrumental sources. So for parts of the 19th century, in this case. These kinds of methods can be actually pretty sophisticated, particularly in those parts of the world that are well covered by textual sources. So China is the ultimate example. In China, we can go back hundreds, even thousands of years, and we can use records of weather, descriptions of weather. We can quantify those, but here in China, we can also find a correlation between our quantified qualitative sources and modern instrumental records, right? And using that correlation, that calibration, we can have more confidence in our reconstructions that are developed and using qualitative sources going well back in time, hundreds of years back in time. But the archives of societies also have their limitations. They are really good for those parts of the world that are well covered by textual sources, which for some parts of the world really only go back into the 19th century. And they're not good for parts of the oceans, for example, or the poles. So in order to get a much broader picture, we use something called the archives of nature. And these are just parts of the natural world that responded in some way to climatic changes. Maybe their growth changed, their composition changed. And by carefully studying what they look like now, by studying their composition, we can gain an indirect record of how weather has changed in the past. And this is just a map of 8 different kinds of archives of nature that have been exhumed with money from National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. But there are really dozens of these things. Give you a sense of how they work. Well, you can think of forests as one big archive of nature. Because of course, in temperate regions, trees undergo growing seasons. There's a layer of wood underneath the bark that grows quickly at the beginning of a growing season. And when it does, the cell walls are stretched out, right? These cells are all elongated. But at the end of a growing season, the cells bunch up and their walls are much thicker. And that's what accounts for these rings that you can see. We've all seen them in trees. Now, the width of these rings is correlated to weather during the growing season. That's one influence on tree growth. And so for that reason, tree rings are an excellent proxy for past climatic change, but they're much better for some periods of time than others. So here you can see the amount of proxies in this map. Trees account for a lot over the last 5 centuries, but that quantity goes down as you go further back in time. Trees don't actually live that long. You can use fossilized trees to go back thousands of years, but for the most part, tree rings are excellent for the last 5 centuries or so, and they just keep getting worse after that. Also, some regions are much more useful for this proxy, for this natural archive than other regions. Those areas that are already arid, for example, trees will respond very dramatically to changes in precipitation. But for regions that usually get plenty of rainfall anyway, that is not the case. So you can see here, I hope you can see it in the back. For example, where I'm from, Washington, DC, trees really don't tell us all that much about changes in weather and climate because they usually get enough rainfall and it's warm enough anyway. But in those areas where it's already quite dry, then changes in rainfall can matter a lot. And your tree rings can tell you a great deal about fluctuations and precipitation. Now, there are many more sophisticated ways of analyzing trees than just looking at the width of rings. There's something called quantitative wood analysis, for example, where you will analyze the different structure of cells. So we have many, many different ways now of analyzing tree rings that are a good deal more precise than just a width. So what do the archives of societies and the archives of nature collectively tell us? Well, if you're on social media, you might think it looks a little bit like this. You might think that these archives tell us that the past was a lot warmer than the present, for example, right? This is a graph that comes up all the time on what is now called X. And in fact, these were reconstructions that made some sense decades ago. They are now completely obsolete. Nevertheless, a version of them is in fact used in many of the most popular accounts of past climatic change and its social impacts. This is from probably the most popular account of the Little Ice Age. And you can see a dramatic climate reconstruction right here, where the Little Ice Age seems to be colder than global warming is hot. A Little Ice Age, a period of climatic cooling between about the 13th and the 19th centuries. Now, what many historians and archaeologists may do is use the assumption that there is a kind of ideal climate for society to then connect large-scale changes in climate to human history. This is something that comes from one of the first, what I would call climate histories by somebody called Ellsworth Huntington in the early 20th century. And it's based on the racist idea that the climate of Western Europe and the United States is particularly well suited for civilization. And the idea here is that that ideal climate for civilization has changed its position over time. And that is then what accounts for the rise and fall of empires. This basic idea accounts for many of the most influential studies in this field that blame climate change for the fall of the Akkadian Empire, for example, about 4,000 years ago, or the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, or the disappearance of Norse settlements in Greenland, or the late classical Maya in the Yucatan Peninsula. All of these examples of collapse are based on simplistic reconstructions of climate change, a little bit similar to what I just showed you, maybe a little bit more sophisticated. There's also a way of quantifying or a method of doing this kind of history more quantitatively, pioneered by geographers from the University of Hong Kong. And to follow this method, what you would do is quantify changes in human history. For example, changes in violence. You would find the annual frequency of warfare in imperial Chinese history and compare that to a climate reconstruction for China. And if you find statistically significant correlations between violence and climate, you might argue that the variable of climate controls the variable of violence in Chinese history, as many of these scholars have done. But in fact, what climate reconstructions tell us is really complicated and above all, messy. So this is a lot to take in, and I guess it probably isn't visible at the back, but I really love it. It's really important to me, and it should be really important to all of us. Here you can see different reconstructions of the Holocene geological epoch, so the last 12,000 years, compiled using different archives of nature and different statistical methods. And what they tell us is something meaningfully different. They either indicate that there's been a gradual warming over the Holocene, culminating in the present, or that there was a rapid warming and then a gradual cooling after that rapid warming in the beginning of the Holocene, right? So for the last 12,000 years, we actually have a pretty unclear picture of how climate has in fact changed. We have a much clearer picture of the last 2,000 years, but even then, it's not perfect. We have these two different reconstructions, which are different because they were developed using different statistical methods, right? And they tell us the same basic picture, right? It's really hot now, and it was cooler in the past. But if you are a historian or an archaeologist trying to determine the impact of climate on history, it matters a great deal if the Little Ice Age was 0.1 degrees Celsius colder than the average over the last 2,000 years, or 0.4 degrees Celsius, right? That is a huge difference, as we all know now, in trying to grapple with global warming. Even when we use the same proxy sources, so tree rings, here are 6 different ways of using tree rings for just the Northern Hemisphere. And overall, again, they tell us the same picture, but there are particular periods where you can see that they tell us something very different. So if you are trying to connect climate change to the history of these periods, you should know that even the same proxy sources interpreted differently will tell us something completely different. So we have to be very careful in how we use reconstructions. I started to realize just how complicated the connection between climatic history and human history is, probably when doing some of my research on the Arctic and on expeditions to the Arctic, on the exploitation of whales in the Arctic during some of the coldest decades of the Little Ice Age, where I assumed that fewer people would go to the Arctic, fewer Europeans in some of these really cold years. Maybe there'd be fewer whales harvested. But in fact, I found the exact opposite, that more bowhead whales were more easily accessible during some of the chilliest decades of the Little Ice Age. So I started to think that there are often counterintuitive connections between climate and history that are kind of lost from these case studies of collapse. Spurred partly by that realization, let me see, I'm having a lot of problems with this PowerPoint, to be honest. Hopefully you can see that. No, but in any case, I will ditch the PowerPoint and simply say that we developed a new framework for doing climate history in a 2021 article in the journal Nature. And as part of that framework, we ask a bunch of questions, binary questions that we suggest that scholars should follow in order to pursue their research. These questions then led us to looking for case studies of resilience in the face of climate change rather than collapse. And we found different pathways by which populations could be resilient in the face of climate change. So the PowerPoint is not working, but I will just say that this stuff is really important. We have to know how climate has changed in the past and how populations responded to those climate changes to gain a clear picture of where we might be headed in the future. So I think that's exactly 20 minutes. I'm sorry for the PowerPoint. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Being like, hey, 20 minutes.
That's so true.
All right, let's try and see if my computer will talk nicely, and if not, we can bring back friends.
There is the other, yeah, there's the other laptop as well.
Yes. Let's see. Usually my computer is pretty good with HDMI cords, unless it is the HDMI cord for the computer at the center. Wow, you've made it very shrinky. It definitely thinks it's stuck. Oh, there we go.
Oh, no.
All right.
Oh.
Okay, we can all take a moment to admire my cat looking very cute. All right.
Yeah, this is intense.
I know. It makes everything very tiny. All right, but I have a slideshow up. All right, brilliant. Okay, so thank you for inviting me here to talk about premodern data, conflict and catastrophe. There's going to be a lot of both over the next 15, 20 minutes. So this is your heads up that people are going to die in this talk, a lot, a very lot. They're gonna die mostly of plague, but also from influenza and malaria, smallpox and tuberculosis. They're also going to drown, be murdered, and randomly drop dead. The one thing they are not going to die of is boredom, unless you count one person in 1582 who died of taking great thought. That's the way I want to go. Before we get started, a moment of shameless self-promotion. I have a book. It's awesome. You can enjoy it even if you're scared of numbers. I promise. All right, there it is. Okay, so time to set the scene. Imagine it's November of 1665 and plague is ravaging the city of London, capital of England. A man named Samuel Pepys attends a sermon where the chaplain complains about human attempts to understand the natural world, and specifically says all of our physicians can't tell what nagu is, and all of our arithmetic is not able to number the days of a man. Pepys records this in his diary, but adds his own opinion as well, which God knows is not the fault of arithmetic, but that our understanding reach not that thing. So the men and women of 17th century England didn't yet have the ability to differentiate between different causes of human fevers or quantitatively predict human lifespans, but they believed that they would eventually be able to do so. And in fact, for over 100 years, they had been avidly attempting to use numbers to understand and predict the spread of plague and the chances of dying from plague through a series of documents known as the London Bills of Mortality, which is what I am going to focus on today. A little bit of context for those of you who are plague junkies. Plague was a regular threat during the early modern period. It entered England during the Black Deaths, 1348. We're all pretty familiar with that. And it's somewhere in England, basically almost every single year until it finally peters out in the 1680s. So it's often in some ways endemic, although my scientist friends always start yelling, no, it's not technically endemic because it's a zoonotic disease. Right, we know what I'm talking about here, right? Like it's just there, it's in the population. But there are epidemic years. These are the most famous ones, of course. And cities are particularly vulnerable to major outbreaks where they can lose up to 1/3 of their population in each one of these. London alone loses nearly 250,000 people to plague. It caused 1 in 5 plague deaths, 1 in 5 of the city's deaths between 1603 and 1665. There's 2 different theories of what causes plague based on 2 different ideas of God's providence. One, the idea that God has kind of a general providence, which is his maintenance of the world through the natural order as established during creation. And then the idea of God's special providence, which is miraculous interruptions of the natural order to punish or reward. And it's these 2 views that both compete and coexist during the early modern period. And we can see an example of them competing and coexisting here. This is a ballad from the 1636 plague outbreak. It's colloquially known as a Lord have mercy, which is basically a whole series of prayers fit to be used in this time of sickness. So you can pray to God for forgiveness from sins, surrounded by quantitative data pulled from the Bills of Mortality. And this quantitative data was used to try to understand these natural laws, these patterns that govern plague. And so these are from the Bills of Mortality, which I promise I will tell you more about in a minute. But these numbers are of intense public interest. So everyone take a moment. I know we don't want to, but think back to March 2020 or even April 2020 when we were all obsessing over COVID numbers, right? That's the mentality that we are seeing here. And in fact, this is the, not 1636, but like this, this is the first evidence that we've seen of this kind of quantitative obsessiveness over contagious disease numbers in European history. I say European history because I don't know the rest of the world. I'm pretty sure anywhere in the world, but somewhere there's a Chinese scholar who will probably jump up and say, wait a minute, China did it first because China's did everything first. So European history. So literally these numbers are everywhere. And they show up in all sorts of documents. They even show up in sermons. So one of my favorite sermons from the 1603 epidemic, just imagine like this old school fire and brimstone preacher standing up in front of his congregation and exhorting them to cool not in your devotion because the number of the buried in our parish has fallen, blessed by God, from 305 to 51 in 1 week and from 57 to 4 buried in 1 day. Shall our love for God cool when God's love is kindled? Right? This is coming out of the pulpit here. So for this particular preacher, proof of God's love was literally in the numbers. These numbers are everywhere. Okay, so with that kind of setting of the scene, it's time to focus on the good stuff, which is our quantitative data found in the Bills of Mortality. The Bills of Mortality are a fantastic resource, but they are also a bit complicated from a data perspective because it's a long-running series of documents that basically go for like over 300 years. They change over time, as one might imagine. So these are weekly statistics collected from across the city of London by a parochial infrastructure. So there's a bunch of women called the Searchers for the Dead. They have to go, they have to look at every single body. They report this information to their parish clerk. The parish clerk then reports this information to the worshipful company of parish clerks, which is like their central guild, who then collect all this information and turn it around really, really fast. They have very sleepless nights every Wednesday night, so they can get their Thursday bills out. They turn it around and provide it to the city authorities and also to the monarch. And this starts in the 1520s. A lot of ink has been spilled on the accuracy of the data that goes into the bills of mortality. So I'm just going to take a moment now and we can talk more in Q&A, but my quick 2 cents. This parochial infrastructure means that people outside the structure of parish lives can absolutely be lost out of the data set. This is especially true when we get into the 18th century, the rise of dissenters who are not formally part of the Church of England. And in fact, this is why the bills of mortality end. Not because they fall out of use, but because they're so useful that they realize they need to re-encompass all of these people outside the Church of England. So they get rid of the church-based mortality statistics and come up with a civil-based series of mortality statistics. The General Register continues to the present day. I mentioned this during the people who came to coffee and cookies at 3 p.m. Just flag here, my data project actually ends in 1752, not because the bill's in there, but because calendar reform takes 11 days out of the calendar. And I refuse to create a data set with 11 missing days randomly in 1 year, because I know no one will read the documentation and then they will get very confused when their data is messed up. Okay, so the data has some flaws, but the data itself was as good as people could make it during this time period. The searchers had a symptom-based criteria. They were trained to identify people's death based on symptoms, right? They can't tell you why someone had a fever, but they can say, yes, this person had a fever. They also often noted in bills when they had a problem with the data. In the 1740s in particular, they're really fond of calling out parishes that didn't get their reports in that week and have to report the next week. And they're like, this is 2 weeks worth of data because someone didn't get their act together, right? So they care very much about the accuracy of the data. And in fact, they even sometimes note in the bills when they have problems with the data and just kind of do their best faith attempt. And the best example I've seen of this is during the English Civil Wars. There's a gunpowder explosion in the area outside the Tower of London. And they're reporting in the bills like, okay, we have this many bodies from this parish, this many bodies from this parish, and we have a bunch of pieces. And I can't tell you how many people are in the pieces, but there's pieces of strangers, right? So they're putting in the uncertainty in the data and being very explicit about what they do and do not know. So basically, I really do like the comparison of this to modern COVID data. We all know modern COVID data is flawed, but it is the best that we could create. It is not perfect, but it's good enough to work with. Same thing is true of the early modern bills of mortality. All right, with that long aside on the accuracy of the bills, this is what one of the early bills look like. This is from 1562. And as you can see, it's a manuscript document. It is a simple list of parishes in the city of London and the number of deaths in each parish. Over time, they become more complicated. The manuscript copies that are submitted to the monarch actually grow to include all causes of death. So we see over here, this is a bill that was submitted to Queen Elizabeth in 1591. And it has things like, in the parish of All Hallows Barking died one person who was long sick. In St. Andrew's Wardrobe, one person died of an ague, which is a shivering fever. One of consumption, which is the historical name for tuberculosis. In St. Andrew's in Holborn, which is in the suburbs, and it's a much unhealthy place to be. We have 3 infant deaths and 2 people who are long sick, but not all of the deaths are really depressing. There's someone in St. Andrew Undershaft who dies of great age. So that's a pretty good way to go. There's also chrisms, which is infant death in the first 30 days of life, pleurisy, which is lung inflammation, and the weird one on this bill is the new disease. We're guessing syphilis, can't swear to it. On the other side, we see one that is submitted to King Charles II in 1666. So in the 17th and 18th century, they continue to be submitted to the monarch, but now instead of a totally handwritten bill, we have kind of this fancy pre-printed form that is filled out every week, saves them the time of writing the parish's name. In this bill, we also see lots of consumption, convulsions, ague, fever, chrisms, infants. Probably the people on Zoom can see this better than the people in the room, sorry. Lots of ways to die here. There's one plague death in there, as well as measles and rickets begin to make an appearance. There are still a handful of people dying of great age, but even though other infectious diseases are present and killing a lot of people, the main concern of these bills is plague. It continues to be singled out. It has its own column in the record keeping. So it's like all deaths are quantified, and then like, here's the plague ones. Again, this comparison with COVID, right? When we were talking about like the people who've died this week and the people who've died of COVID, this extra like flagging of a specific disease of concern to the population. By the end of the 16th century, there was a growing popular interest in knowing weekly death rates. So when epidemic plague broke out in 1603, they began printing weekly bills of plague deaths that they could disseminate to the general population. And by disseminate, I mean sell and make money. So ordinary people had access to the data on a weekly basis. It's much simpler though than what was submitted to the monarch. You can see it's focused really just on the plague deaths. And they printed so many that something like 1 in 4 people in the city could have purchased one each week. The bill morphs in format a little during the first year of publication. You can see here a variant from a few weeks later. They devote extra space instead to burials from previous epidemics, as well as some totals from the previous weekly bills of the 1603 epidemic and some running totals, again, to contextualize how bad the 1603 epidemic had shaped up to be. These are the graphs that I was like frantically making on my own computer early in the pandemic because I couldn't get the data I wanted. So I call this the 1603 epidemic, but if you paid attention to the slide a little while back, it really lasts 8 years, and it's worse every summer, dies down every winter, and indeed in this era, plague is a late summer disease, so it's bad. You know it's really bad when people are dying of plague in January. That's a bad sign. So the weekly bills basically stabilized and became a regular feature of 17th century London life, and they're continuously printed into the 19th century. By the middle of the 17th century, another plague outbreak here, we can see 404 plague deaths this week. This is kind of the way the bills begin to be standardized. It includes London parishes along with all the parishes in the adjacent counties and city of Westminster. At first, they tracked the Westminster parishes separately below the totals for London, since Westminster is technically a separate city. But as the city of London's population kind of expands, like urban sprawl, Westminster is eventually completely incorporated into what we today would call the Greater London metro area, but which contemporaries called within the bills. So the bills of mortality literally became the geographical name for all of the area covered by this data collection. So that is both an indication of how significant this data source was to the contemporary people, and also a source of great frustration when you search for bills of mortality in databases today, and instead you find things talking about like, this act will be relevant within the bills of mortality, and you know they're just using it for the geographical term. In all of these 17th century bills, you get the total number of deaths in each parish, the total number of deaths from plague, subtotals for the city within the ancient Roman walls, and then right outside the walls in the city suburbs, and then the city of Westminster. And then, let's see, hang on a second, I've lost track. So you get all of these kind of like subdivisions here. So this is kind of the way they're interested in clumping the data. It's not something that's really of interest to us in the modern day, but they felt very strongly about like these geographical regions of the city, and they wanted to know about that. The bills also at this point have expanded in scope beyond just plague. And so we get a summary of the other causes of death throughout the city. So it's simpler than what the monarch saw, but people in the city itself can see that, for example, 17 people died of old age. That's the good news. But we had 4 women die in childbirth and 12 infant deaths. You can also see which ones the big killers are, which are still tuberculosis and convulsions and assorted fevers, also griping in the guts, which is various stomach illnesses, and bad teeth. And these bills also get very specific geographical information on accidental deaths and homicides, for example, that explosion that I talked about earlier, and begins to give us information on christenings by gender. So this is additional data that they decided that they just might as well collect while they were doing this. You can also see here that 229 people are born and 336 people died in this particular week. And this is standard. More people died than were born every single week of the bills. So these are basically death traps. They're demographic sinks. And then my favorite part of the standardized format of the bills is the price of bread, which was set by the government to avoid price gouging. And this is where they decided it was most likely to disseminate to the wider population. They put it here because this is where people would see it. The bills continued to change over time, though. By the 18th century, bread price information expanded to include a variety of different sizes and types. They also began tracking additional demographic information, age, and time of death. I chose this bill at random, and I really should replace it from my slide deck because it's a bit atypical. There's only 6 deaths above the age of 90. It's not uncommon to see like even 1 or 2 deaths in the 100+ range, and those get flagged by exact age. So if you make it to 100, your exact age at the time of death, like 102, will be put onto the bills of mortality. They also printed annual summaries of the bills, again with burials and plague deaths by parish, and their various subtotals, christenings, and then the diseases and casualties citywide. As you can see here, the vast majority of deaths are things like infant mortality, consumption and cough. Where are some of the other big ones? Bloody flex is a big one. So there's kind of standard deaths that you see from year to year. But there's also some interesting small numbers for people who are kind of curious in these things. For example, this particular bill has 3 people who die of epilepsy, of falling sickness, and 18 people found dead in the streets and fields. And this is where I like to say the weirdest place I've ever seen someone found dead on one of the bills of mortality is found dead in a coffin. Okay, came ready to bury, I guess. So this is kind of like the official bills, but there's also all sorts of ad hoc stuff. Copying data into blank bills, for example, or into Lord Have Mercies, correcting the bills, making all sorts of manuscript annotations. So when people are getting this data, they're taking it and they're not just buying the bills and sort of like putting them on the shelves, they are reading them, they are remixing it, they are copying and correcting and checking the data. Again, this is like 2020 COVID numbers. They are of extreme interest to the people who purchase and keep these bills. Okay, so there's lots of these bills. There's tens of thousands of these bills, and they shift format over time, and the documents themselves are not easy to digitize because they're poor print quality and they're like tightly bound. And so getting the data out is a pain in the butt. This is what we use DataScribe for. This is a plugin for Omeka S. And there is a beta version for 4.x. So if you want to use DataScribe, you can, and please file a GitHub issue if you find any problems with it. So this is meant to help us transcribe the bills. Basically, it lets you import your images into Omeka, create a data set up a transcription form, and set requirements for the type of data input, which we need because this is a very large project team. And so we need to standardize the data. This helps us do it. This is the ERD for my first attempts to describe the database structure. You can see it's a mess and it's incomplete. So we simplified it a lot when we actually built the database that underlies the website. This is our API documentation, which you can read about if you're really curious. You access the API via our graphical user interface, which is the thing that will digitally decay first and like crash and burn. So for the long term, we also have CSVs. The CSVs will be eternal. And this is what a lot of the students who work on the project choose to just go straight to the CSVs. So we've done some analysis of the data that I'm going to bang through really, really quickly because I'm at like 20 minutes and I don't want to get like, sung off the stage, whatever the ME style but so we've done some preliminary analysis on the data. We've created GIS shape files and kind of mapped it, which is always exciting because the city burns down. So you can look at like changes in the data when the city burns down. This is another annoying complication of the data set because this is basically a ruin for 3 years. So they have no data. They're like data in the demolished parishes. It's very, again, they flag that they have problems with it, but it's still annoying. We've done some network analysis looking at the way the river helps as a way for people to move throughout the city. And then all the students on the project have done their own really cool projects. So if you want to go through our blog on the deathbynumbers.org website, you can see cool things my students have done. This is a time to event analysis one of my students did. Here's some stuff on annual mortality trends, again, on our blog. I have a student who's been working on maternal mortality. from the monarchical bills, and then looking more generally at different causes by parish in the monarchical bills. Okay, so basically, as early as the 17th century then, people saw and understood the potential of mortality statistics to help them understand the world around them. Again, we saw that great quote from Pepys during the 1665 outbreak. But in the ensuing 400 years, we've learned a lot about both mathematics and the natural world. And it's a combination then of the 17th century data collection and the 21st century methods that make death by numbers possible. So here's, I end with the URL and a formal shout out to the current project team. The full project team with alumni is on the website. These are the people who make this possible. I'm the one standing and talking to you, and I do a lot of work on the project, but there's a lot more of the project than just me.